January 31st, 1953. 307 people were killed in England. 19 more died in Scotland. 24,500 English homes were damaged or destroyed. More than 30,000 people were forced to leave them. Across the water, in the Netherlands, 1,836 people were killed. 72,000 were evacuated. 4,300 homes and buildings were destroyed, and 43,000 more were damaged. By around 7:30 that evening, the North Sea flood had reached the coast of Norfolk. Force 10 and Force 11 winds had driven a storm surge into a spring tide. Near the English coast, the sea rose almost 3 meters above its expected level. Waves higher than 8 meters moved across open water. Sea defenses broke, and the North Sea entered streets where people had gone to bed, believing the land would hold. Hours before the water reached South Beach, Reis Lee Leming was 22 years old, an Airman second class and aerial gunner with the United States Air Force. He served in the 67th Air Rescue Squadron at RAF Sculthorpe. His unit existed to reach people in danger. But Leming carried one private limitation into a disaster made entirely of water. He could not swim. When the defenses failed, seawater poured into the low streets of Hunstanton. Homes became islands. Families climbed above the rising water. Calls for help moved through the darkness, appearing and disappearing beneath the wind. At the airbase, the rescue call came in. Leming went with the others. He was heading toward a flooded town, in the middle of the night, to enter water that could kill him even if he never lost his footing. But to understand what happened on that day, you have to go back to the early hours of January 30th, when the system looked like an ordinary North Atlantic depression just south of Iceland. Its central pressure was 996 millibars. Nothing about that number alone announced a catastrophe. Then the depression began to deepen rapidly as it traveled east. By 6 that evening, near the Faroe Islands, its pressure had fallen to 980 millibars. By noon the following day, it had reached the North Sea between northeastern Scotland and southern Norway. The center was down to 968 millibars, and it would briefly deepen to 966. But low pressure was only one side of the machine. To the west, a powerful ridge of high pressure had formed over the Atlantic south of Iceland. Its pressure exceeded 1,030 millibars. Air accelerates from high pressure toward low pressure, and the sharp difference between these two systems created a steep pressure gradient over the northern North Sea. That gradient produced a relentless flow from the north. Force 10 and Force 11 winds struck exposed parts of Scotland and northern England. Across the water, the wind field stretched for roughly 1,000 kilometers, aimed down the length of the North Sea toward the most vulnerable coasts. This created 2 layers of the surge. First, low pressure removed some of the atmosphere's weight from the sea. A fall of 1 millibar raises sea level by about 1 centimeter, so the pressure effect near a deep storm center can approach half a meter. But wind was the primary driver in 1953. It dragged across the surface, hour after hour, transferred momentum into the water, and forced that water south. The storm did not carry a fixed wall from the Atlantic. It built the surge inside the North Sea itself. Then geography amplified what the atmosphere had started. The North Sea is open and relatively deep in the north. Toward the south, it becomes shallower and more confined. Water driven down the basin cannot continue forward indefinitely. It slows, accumulates, and rises against narrowing coastlines. The surge began off northeastern Scotland. It moved south along the eastern coasts of Scotland and England, growing as it traveled. It was not a wave with a single visible crest. It was an abnormal elevation of the entire sea surface, hundreds of kilometers wide, carrying ordinary waves on top of it. The storm surge was the extra water created by wind and low pressure. The astronomical tide was the predictable rise and fall caused by the moon and sun. The storm tide was their combined level, with individual waves breaking above it. On this night, the surge arrived during a spring tide. The term does not refer to the season. It occurs when the sun, moon, and earth align and strengthen the normal tidal range. The tide raised the starting level, just as the wind-driven surge reached the coast. The timing removed the margin for error. Force 10 and Force 11 winds generated waves more than 8 meters high in the open North Sea. Because the surge had already elevated the water, those waves could attack higher sections of dunes, embankments, and concrete walls. The surge lifted the weapon. The waves delivered the blows. Coastal defenses do not always fall at once. Water first overtops them, erodes the unprotected inner slope, and scours material from foundations. Once an opening forms, the concentrated current tears it wider. Along the English coast, beaches and dunes were stripped away. Timber-piled defenses broke. Concrete seawalls crumbled. Around the wash, embankments were overtopped, allowing water to spread across low land towards settlements such as Hunstanton. Across the Netherlands, the exposure was even more severe. Many communities stood on reclaimed land below sea level. Official Dutch records describe dikes in the southwest that were too low, too weak, and inadequately maintained. After the Second World War, money and attention had been directed toward national reconstruction. The sea defenses carried the consequences of that delay. The storm lasted for more than 24 hours. Dutch dikes failed at more than 150 locations. The first inundation did not end the danger. Another high tide arrived the following afternoon, driving more water through defenses that had already been opened. The physical disaster was now complete. A rapidly deepening depression, a powerful pressure gradient, a vast northerly wind field, a long shallow sea, a spring tide, high waves, and defenses that could not survive the combined load. But a natural hazard becomes a human catastrophe through one more failure. The surge had been forecast several hours before it arrived. The science had seen the danger. The warning system could not reliably carry that danger to the people in its path. Britain had no coordinated National Flood Warning Organization for the exposed East Coast. Winds brought down telephone lines in Lincolnshire and Norfolk. So almost no warning of the storm's true severity reached counties farther south before the water did. In the Netherlands, radio did not broadcast continuously through the night. A forecast existing in an office was not the same as a warning reaching a bedroom. The surge traveled south with ruthless order. Darkness fell as Lincolnshire took the first impacts. Later, it entered the Wash and northern Norfolk. By midnight, flooding had reached Suffolk and Essex. Then, the elevated sea turned northeast across the southern basin and reached the Dutch coast in the early hours of February 1st. There was no single cause of the North Sea flood. The storm supplied the energy. The pressure gradient organized the wind. The wind moved the water. The shape of the North Sea concentrated it. The spring tide raised the baseline. Waves broke the defenses. Weak communications left families in place. Remove any one of those layers, and the night might have been less destructive. Together, they turned ordinary rooms into traps. Reis Lee Leming was an American airman from East St. Louis, Illinois. At 22, he was serving overseas as an aerial gunner in a rescue squadron. The people endangered at South Beach included local families and members of the American military community attached to nearby bases. They were civilians, children, fellow servicemen, and families living far from home. Leming did not need to know each name to understand the bond. They were the community around him, and they were calling for help. No verified account tells us exactly how he spent the last quiet hours of that Saturday. What the record does show is that when the emergency reached RAF Sculthorpe, The 67th Air Rescue Squadron mobilized. Leming left the safety of the base and went toward Hunstanton. South Beach was almost unrecognizable. Streets had vanished beneath black seawater. Broken timber and household debris moved in the current. The wind swallowed instructions. The cold began working against every exposed hand, every exhausted body, every person waiting above the flood. Leming put on an anti-exposure suit. He took a rubber life raft and waded out. The water rose to his shoulders. He could not swim. That fact did not disappear because he was brave. It made every step a calculation. His feet had to remain beneath him. His grip had to hold. The raft had to stay close. If the current lifted him, if debris knocked him down, or if the suit failed, he would become another person who needed to be rescued. Leming later remembered the moment in plain words. I heard people screaming and saw flashlights, and I knew someone had to go. So he went. He pulled the raft through the current. Through the current, reached people cut off by the flood, and brought them back toward higher ground. Then he turned around and entered the water again, and again. The rescue was not a single dash. It was repeated exposure. Each journey took strength from his legs and warmth from his body. The suit that separated him from the water was damaged and began filling with the same freezing sea he had entered to keep away. There was no heroic silence in the flood itself. There was the hammering wind, the slap of waves against walls, timber breaking, people shouting, rescuers calling directions they could barely hear. And then there were pockets of dead silence. The moment after a cry stopped. The pause while a flashlight searched an empty stretch of water. The breath before someone answered from the darkness. In that silence, Leming kept moving. He was not alone in Hunstanton. Other airmen from the 67th, British emergency workers, local responders, and civilians were carrying out rescues across the flooded district. Their work saved many lives that night. But Leming's own path through the water became extraordinary. Over roughly 8 hours, he made 3 trips with the raft. By the end of them, 27 people had been brought out alive through his actions, including children. After the 3rd journey, hypothermia and exhaustion overcame him. He collapsed. The man who could not swim had spent the night walking into the sea until 27 other people no longer had to face it alone. Mourning did not make the loss easier to understand. 31 people died at Hunstanton, 15 local residents and 16 Americans. Along the coast from Snettisham to South Hunstanton, 65 people were killed. Across England and Scotland, the death toll reached 326. These were not numbers waiting for history books. They were empty chairs at breakfast, parents searching lists, children waiting for adults who would not return, families on both sides of the Atlantic receiving news from a shoreline many had never seen. Across the Netherlands, the scale was larger still. 1,836 people died. Tens of thousands of homes and buildings were destroyed or damaged. Farms disappeared beneath salt water. Communities learned, by daylight, which neighbors were gone. The flood forced governments to treat the North Sea differently. Britain created a dedicated storm tide warning service and strengthened coastal defenses. The long process of planning for extreme water levels also helped shape the system of barriers and protections that would later include the Thames Barrier. In the Netherlands, the disaster led directly to the Delta Commission and the Delta Works, a vast system of dams, dikes, sluices, and storm surge barriers designed to prevent a night like this from happening again. The engineering mattered. So did the warning systems. 7 decades later, when another major surge reached the English coast, communities had forecasts, organized evacuations, and defenses built from the lessons of 1953. Leming recovered. For his actions, the United States awarded him the Soldier's Medal. Britain awarded him the George Medal, making him the first non-Briton to receive that medal for bravery in peacetime. He never treated the story as proof that he was fearless. Years later, his family remembered a simpler way he described it. He had been in the wrong place at the right time. That modesty can hide the true shape of courage. Courage is not the absence of a limit. It is knowing exactly where the limit is, feeling the cold water rise toward it, and moving forward because someone else cannot. Every storm eventually ends, but the way we hold each other through it, that remains. Take care of one another. If this story deserves to be remembered, please leave a like and subscribe. Your support gives us the time to research these lives with the care they deserve.